In September of 1985, two teenagers were found brutally murdered in Westside Park in Muncie, Indiana. Despite numerous suspects and theories, the case has remained eerily unsolved, with initial suspects including family members and even major members of the local community. I'm Enrique Couto, and tonight we're digging in to the Westside Park murders. In September 1985, a doctor's daughter and a factory worker's son were found dead at Westside Park in Muncie, Indiana. Their killer had never been found. In the beginning, the police had a list of suspects from the people they knew best, from their families to serial killers. There have been theories as to why Kimberly Dowell and Ethan Dixon were murdered, from drugs, random targets, and family disputes. But 37 years later, the case is still cold. Muncie, Indiana is located about 50 miles from the city's capital, Indianapolis. There wasn't much to do in the town of Muncie, other than a high school football game, visit the mall, or see a movie. The Breakfast Club, Rocky IV, Rambo First Blood Part 2, and many other films were released in 1985, making them the place for teenagers to be. On September 22, 1985, a Saturday, Ethan Dixon, age 16, went to pick up his girlfriend, 15-year-old Kimberly Dowell, from her house. Kimberly lived with her mother Nancy and her stepfather Donald Vogelson. Anthony Dowell, Kimberly's father, was a doctor in Muncie. Ethan lived with his father, a factory worker. Ethan Dixon was the president of the junior class and a member of the debate team. Kimberly Dowell was a junior varsity cheerleader who was elected to become homecoming queen. At 11:50 p.m., Terry Winters, a Muncie police officer, was walking his canine dog when he spotted a red Volkswagen hatchback with the engine still running. The sight of a car in the park wasn't unusual because it occurred relatively frequently. Officer Winters was at the park to inform anyone there that they had to leave because of the park's closure at 11 p.m. Fresh tire tracks at the west end of the park led him to the red Volkswagen. He grabbed his flashlight, shined it inside the vehicle, and was surprised by what he discovered there. He saw two bodies, later identified as Ethan Dixon and Kimberly Dowell. They were both fully clothed, so the crime was not sexually motivated. Officer Winters dialed 911, and Joe Winkle, another officer, and then more officers as well as the coroner arrived at the scene. The time of death was reported as occurring between 11 and 11:50 p.m. Police announced that they had no suspects and there was no clear motive. Ethan died from a single gunshot wound to the torso, while Kimberly died from a gunshot wound to the left temple. A third shot was fired, shattering the window on the passenger side. Inside the vehicle, police discovered a knife on the dashboard and a gun holster under Ethan's body. But there was no gun present. Witnesses reported seeing 3 people near the car around the time the shots were fired, but no one was able to identify them. A pathology resident completed the autopsy on September 29th. In Indiana, performing an autopsy without any training or expertise in the medical field was regarded as usual. It is crucial to have a person with education and medical training look into the cause of death because they are better equipped than someone who is not as trained. Former police officers and firefighters were voted by the locals to serve as coroners in Indiana. Funeral home directors even took on the roles of coroners at times. Kimberly's cause of death was a gunshot wound to her head near her left ear. There were no signs of alcohol or drugs, but they did find traces of acetaminophen, most likely from Tylenol. Ethan was shot in the left side of his chest near his 6th rib. His coronary artery, heart, and lungs were lacerated by the bullet, and his cause of death was ruled as a gunshot wound to the chest that resulted in exsanguination, also known as significant blood loss. Both of the seats in the car were reclined, and Kimberly and Ethan had sleeping bags draped over their heads. Kimberly was discovered lying on her back, with her arms raised above her head. Muncie police received numerous tips from people who believed they had information on the murders as the investigation progressed, but the tips led to nothing. On October 1st, police stated that there were 10 cars believed to be in the park at the time of the murders, but they were able to narrow it down to just 2 cars, a red car and a black or dark-colored Chevrolet Monte Carlo, which was a very common vehicle at the time. The first suspect, who was later eliminated, was the owner of a Muncie restaurant, who frequently went to the local gun range. A deputy marshal from another town claimed to have been in Westside Park on the night of the murders, and could identify the suspect who was driving the car as Donald Vogelson, Kimberly's stepfather. Police said that Donald visited the park after the murders took place. When they stopped Donald at the park's entrance, he asked what happened, and the officers replied that 2 people had been shot. Under hypnosis, they spoke with Deputy Marshall, who claimed to have seen Donald Vogelson at the park after the murders, and then said he saw Donald driving to the spot where Kimberly and Ethan were shot. So the stories are contradictory. Police Chief Campbell focused on Donald Vogelson as the main suspect and started questioning him. Later on, Donald would pass the polygraph test, but, much like hypnosis, they are not entirely reliable and considered a soft science at best. When Police Chief Campbell questioned Donald about whether he had been in the park, Donald responded, "Within my body, I wasn't there. If I was there, you'll have to tell me I was there," he added afterward. The police took the interview transcripts to the Southern Police Institute in Louisville, Kentucky, to better understand Donald. He was characterized as a control freak who most likely wouldn't speak with the police again. They then attempted to speak with Donald once more, but his lawyers informed them that his client would not talk with them again. A composite sketch of a suspect or witness that was seen in a black Chevrolet Monte Carlo at the park the night of the shootings was made public by police officers on October 7th. After that information was public, they received over 100 phone calls the next day. Police acknowledged the rumors that Ethan Dixon got into an argument or confrontation days before the shooting, but insisted that they were simply rumors and not facts. In 1980, 2 young people were shot and killed in their car in Concordia, Kansas. Police Chief Campbell said that despite the similarities between the cases, he didn't think they were related. 2 days later, on September 24th, students returned to class. It was strange returning because they knew someone they had gone to school with had been shot and killed while sitting in their car. Amy Leffingwell, the class treasurer, spoke in a 2019 interview about learning of her friend Ethan's death. She said, "His desk was empty. I had a lot of classes with Ethan," and continued to talk about the aftermath and the lack of support or counseling from teachers, saying, "I don't think they gathered us in a group. If you wanted to talk to somebody, you could, but we mostly talked among ourselves." Kimberly's cheerleading sponsor said in a 2019 interview, "It was probably the worst day of my teaching career, worse than the shuttle exploding, 9/11, and the Oklahoma City bombings, because it was home." Ethan had a friend named Julie Davey who invited him to go away the week he ended up getting murdered. At school, she worked in the office and would collect and record the students' attendance records. The secretary asked if she could disenroll Kimberly and Ethan from the roster, which was very painful for her. 1 year after the murders and still no leads, Muncie police pull over James Jimmy Swingley, age 23, after running a stop sign. At the time, he gave police the fake name of Kevin Dixon which was strange given that Ethan also had the same last name. On the night of the murders, James Swingley went around telling people he was the one to shoot the two teenagers. James allegedly threatened someone, saying, quote, "I've already killed 2 people tonight. I'll blow your brains out." On June 9th, 1972, Jimmy's 8-year-old sister, Cindy Ann, went out into oncoming traffic in front of their house. She was hit by a car and pronounced dead at the hospital. Jimmy and Jackie were Cindy Ann's brothers. Jimmy was born in 1962 and was 9 years old when his sister died. On January 27, 1981, Jackie was arguing with Becky, his wife, when she hit him in the head with a cigarette lighter, and he died. The coroner declared his death a homicide, but the investigators claimed that he died from a brain hemorrhage that had nothing to do with the blow to his head. Jackie and Jimmy were reportedly drinking excessively that day, according to the newspaper. Nobody knows what led to such a heated argument between Jackie, 20, and Jimmy, 18, but the mother of the brothers told a Muncie police officer that Jimmy was the father of the child that Becky, Jackie's wife, had had a little over 9 months after Jackie passed away. The individual wanted for questioning was released in a composite sketch on October 7, 1985, by the deputy police chief. The individual was described as a white man, approximately 5'10", weighing 150 to 160 pounds, about 24 years old, with a slender build and a thin face with acne scars. He also wore glasses and had his hair parted in the middle. In an interview in 2019, authorities later claimed that Jimmy Swingley was the person in the composite sketch. Both Ethan and Kimberly had gunshot residue on them, indicating to the investigators that either their killer was standing close by or the gun was in the car. Jimmy Swingley then moved to Florida and told a police informant that on September 22, 1985, he was with 2 other men, and they were the ones to kill Kimberly and Ethan. On December 5, 1985, Jimmy was arrested in Florida for holding a knife to a man's throat after the man had taunted him. In a phone call to Nancy, Kimberly's mother, she described the call as cruel. The caller claimed that Ethan was the intended target and that Kimberly was just an innocent bystander. Nancy had to deal with her daughter's death and the fact that her husband was considered a suspect. According to Nancy, Donald Vogelson came home after a football game before the shootings, and he didn't leave the house again until around 12:30 a.m. when Nancy told him to check on Kimberly because her curfew was at 11. Only speaking through his attorney, Donald Vogelson claimed to be innocent, and also claimed that the fact that the investigators were so focused on him prevented them from catching the real killer. In a 1997 interview, he stated, quote, "If they had properly conducted a vigorous investigation of the facts that they had and had listened to what Nancy and I had to say, I am convinced that the killer or killers would now be in jail. It was easier to follow one man's preconceived notion that it had to be the stepfather, rather than get down to the hard work of solving a horrible crime." Nancy said, quote, "To me, this is a nightmare that not in my wildest dreams could be made up. I want to know what happened that night, and I would not protect anybody to solve this murder." Nancy passed away in 1987, 2 years after her daughter's passing. She suffered a heart attack while attending a candlelight vigil at the Methodist Church. According to Jimmy Swingley's court records from the mid-1980s to the mid-1990s, he was charged with check deception, drunk driving, theft, burglary, disorderly conduct, and public intoxication, and given 1-year probation. In 1985, when Jimmy was 22 years old, he and other men were accused of racketeering in connection with several commercial robberies. On September 9, 1985, 19 days before the Westside Park murders, his charges were dropped when his lawyers claimed there was no evidence linking him to any of the crimes. Over the years, police received tips from people claiming to know someone who resembled the composite sketch, or to have overheard people discussing the murders, or to have noticed someone acting strangely, and even from a man claiming that a woman killed them on accident because she believed her boyfriend was in the car with another woman. But there was never any proof, and all of those calls went nowhere. Terry Winters, the officer who discovered the bodies, was suspected by some people. In 2014, he was forced to give up his gun for testing after the public contacted the mayor. The testing revealed that his gun was not used in the murders, yet many people continued to associate him with the crime. Many individuals claimed that Jimmy Swingley knew more than he was letting on, even 25 years later. Jimmy underwent a psychological stress test and failed 3 questions when asked about the murders. A man came forward and claimed that Jimmy Swingley came to his house in 1985 after the murders, and that he was afraid the police would be looking for him. Jimmy Swingley claimed that he and 2 other men were involved in a botched drug deal that resulted in the death of 2 teenagers in their car. According to Jimmy, one man pulled the gun from the holster, and then the holster fell off, which lines up with the gun holster being found at the crime scene. A man by the name of James Essex, 19, called the police on November 11, 1996 to report that his 32-year-old roommate, Brian Insco, had been discovered dead and decapitated. They concluded that James beat Brian with a shovel, and Jimmy Swingley cut his throat over Brian owing James $47 in rent. The knife Jimmy used to kill Brian, according to a woman who came forward, was thrown down a storm drain. A second woman claimed that Jimmy had claimed he killed Brian to end his suffering. James negotiated a deal to not be charged with the murder if he testified against Jimmy. A grand jury indicted Jimmy Swingley, now 35, on a murder charge on May 22, 1998. The jury deliberated for 4 hours on February 18, 1999, and he was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 65 years in prison. In March of 2021, a person close to Jimmy Swingley was interviewed, and they said that an associate of Swingley's owned a Monte Carlo, and said that the morning after the murders, Jimmy had told him he was a man who shot 2 people in the Westside Park. The Monte Carlo was taken to Arizona and destroyed. A second woman came forward and said that Jimmy Swingley drove a 1978 or 1979 Monte Carlo. In April of 2012, 2 detectives visited the prison where Jimmy was being held, and he told them, quote, "Fuck you. I don't care what you want. Fuck off." Detectives reviewed the evidence from 1985, but it went nowhere because there was no physical evidence. Kimberly's father, Anthony Dowell, stated in an interview that he last spoke to his daughter on Saturday morning when checking to see whether she planned to visit him over the weekend. But she had said she was unable to because something had come up. Anthony Dowell stated that Donald Vogelson and Kimberly had a good relationship, and he didn't have anything to do with the murders. In a letter to police, Ethan's father expressed his gratitude for their continued investigation into his son's murder. An officer visited Jimmy in prison again in 2018, this time with a body warrant. An officer was able to get Jimmy's DNA in hopes of comparing it to the DNA found on the gun holster. In a 40-minute interview after providing his DNA, Jimmy claimed that he wasn't the murderer and that he believed Kimberly's stepfather was responsible. Jimmy's DNA didn't match the DNA found on the gun holster, and the DNA on the gun holster was fresh after 33 years. There are still no answers, 37 years after Kimberly Dowell and Ethan Dixon were murdered. Locals and police have theorized several suspects, including Donald Vogelson, Kimberly's stepfather, and Jimmy Swingley, who has a lengthy criminal record and is currently serving time for another murder, even though multiple people have come forward and claimed that Jimmy Swingley said he was at the park the night of the murders. And then there's Terry Winters, the police officer who discovered the bodies, and numerous other theories. But as physical evidence deteriorates with time, it's becoming more and more difficult to solve the murder.